Welcome, dear friends. Today, we're going on a heartwarming journey as we explore the story of a widower who finds a second chance at love and family in the midst of his darkest hour. Enjoy the story.
Steve Morgan stood motionless in front of the hospital nursery window, his eyes fixed on the tiny pink bundle squirming in the bassinet. A lump formed in his throat as he watched his newborn daughter, Erin, let out a faint cry. Just 3 days ago, he had buried his beloved wife, Sarah, who had tragically passed away after a difficult 2-day labor. The doctors had warned them about the risks of Sarah's high-risk pregnancy, given her age of 35. Still, Sarah was determined to become a mother, knowing her biological clock was ticking. Despite the complications, the pregnancy had gone smoothly until that fateful day when Sarah went into labor. Steve's mind flashed back to the moment the doctor came out of the delivery room, his face grim. "Mr. Morgan, I'm so sorry. We did everything we could, but we couldn't save her." The words hit Steve like a punch to the gut. He had collapsed into the nearest chair, overcome with uncontrollable sobs. Now, as he gazed at his daughter, Steve felt a bittersweet mix of love and sorrow. How was he supposed to raise this child alone? How could he face the future without Sarah by his side? A nurse approached, holding Erin in her arms. "Mr. Morgan, it's time to take your daughter home," she said gently, placing the baby in his trembling arms. Steve looked down at Erin's tiny face, peaceful in her sleep. He knew he had to be strong for her. He couldn't let her see his pain. With a heavy heart, he carried his daughter out of the hospital, stepping into an uncertain future. At home, Steve was met by Martha, his longtime housekeeper, who had been anxiously awaiting his return. As soon as he stepped inside, she rushed forward with open arms. "Oh, let me see the little angel," she exclaimed, taking Erin from his arms. "She's absolutely precious, Mr. Morgan. She looks just like Mrs. Morgan, bless her soul." Steve's heart tightened at the mention of Sarah. He glanced at Erin, searching for the resemblance, but all he could feel was the weight of his grief. Martha seemed to sense his sorrow. She placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "I know it's hard, Mr. Morgan, but remember, this is your daughter. She's a part of both you and Mrs. Morgan. You have to be strong for her." Steve nodded, swallowing hard. "I know, Martha. It's so hard without Sarah." "I understand," Martha replied softly. "But you're not alone. I'm here to help you every step of the way." A month passed since Steve brought Erin home, and things weren't getting any easier. Night after night, Erin's cries filled the house, leaving Steve utterly exhausted and unsure of how to calm her. He had called the pediatrician twice, desperately seeking advice. Dr. Larson reassured him that Erin was perfectly healthy, attributing her constant crying to Steve's deep sadness. "Babies are very intuitive, Mr. Morgan," Dr. Larson explained over the phone. "Erin can sense your grief. My advice is to hold her close, take her for walks, and try your best not to be visibly upset around her." Steve sighed, running a hand through his hair. He knew the doctor was right, but it was easier said than done. Every time he looked at Erin, he was reminded of the love he had lost. Determined to follow the doctor's advice, Steve began taking Erin on daily walks in the park. He hoped that the fresh air and change of scenery might calm her, and maybe help ease his own pain as well. One day, during one of these walks, Steve noticed a young girl, no older than 7, who appeared from a hole in the park fence. She had a mischievous sparkle in her eye as she skipped toward them, her worn dress fluttering in the breeze. "Hi there," the girl called, peering into Erin's stroller. "What a cute baby." Steve smiled, a little surprised by the girl's boldness. "Thank you. Her name is Erin. I'm Steve. And you are?" "I'm Jessica," the girl said with a grin. "I live in the orphanage on the other side of the fence. I like to sneak out sometimes just to explore." As if on cue, Erin began to fuss, her cries growing louder. Steve reached for her, but Jessica was quicker. "May I?" she asked, motioning gently toward the baby. Steve hesitated but then nodded. He watched in awe as Jessica cradled Erin in her arms, rocking her with surprising tenderness. "Shh, it's okay," Jessica whispered, swaying back and forth. "Sometimes babies just need to be held a certain way. Try laying her on her side like this." To Steve's astonishment, Aaron's cries began to subside almost immediately. He stared at Jessica, both grateful and curious. "How did you know to do that?" he asked, amazed by the girl's instinct. Jessica shrugged, a sad smile tugging at her lips. "I used to have a baby sister," she said quietly, her eyes clouding with emotion. Steve felt a pang of sympathy. He could see the pain in her eyes, and a kinship formed between them, two people bound by shared sorrow. He didn't ask for details, but instead, he offered to buy her an ice cream cone as a small gesture of gratitude. From that day on, Steve and Jessica began meeting in the park daily. Jessica's presence seemed to have a calming effect on Aaron, and Steve began to look forward to their encounters. Slowly, Jessica opened up about her tragic past, how she had lost her entire family in a devastating car accident just months earlier. Steve's heart ached for her. He could see the same pain of loss in her that he felt in himself. One afternoon, when Steve arrived at the park, Jessica was nowhere to be found. Concerned, he waited with Aaron for over an hour before deciding to investigate. He made his way to the orphanage where Jessica lived, hoping to find her there. The orphanage director greeted him with a grave expression. "Mr. Morgan," she said, her voice heavy with worry, "I'm afraid I have some troubling news. Jessica was badly beaten by some of the other children last night. They were jealous of the attention you've been giving her." Steve's heart sank. "Is she okay? Where is she?" "She's recovering in the hospital," the director replied softly. "But I must caution you, Mr. Morgan. Your visits, while kind, may not be in Jessica's best interest. She's been through so much, and forming attachments only to have them severed is not healthy for her." Steve nodded, understanding the director's concerns, but he couldn't bear the thought of abandoning Jessica now. Not after all the joy she had brought into his life. In the days that followed, Steve made a life-changing decision. The more he thought about Jessica and the light she had brought into his dark world, the more he realized that their paths were intertwined. With a renewed sense of purpose, he approached Martha. "Martha, I've made a decision," Steve said, his voice steady. "I'm going to adopt Jessica." Martha's face lit up with surprise and joy. "Mr. Morgan, that's wonderful. I think it's a beautiful idea, and I know Mrs. Morgan would be so proud of you for opening your heart again." Steve smiled, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't felt since Sarah's passing. "I want to convert the guest room into a second nursery for Jessica. Can you help me with that?" "Of course, Mr. Morgan," Martha replied, her eyes shining with happy tears. As Steve made preparations to bring Jessica home, he couldn't help but feel a mixture of excitement and nervousness. Raising two young girls as a single father would be challenging, but it felt like the right thing to do. The day Steve finally brought Jessica home from the hospital, he entered her room with a bouquet of balloons. Jessica's eyes widened in surprise when she saw him. "Steve, what are you doing here?" she asked, her voice filled with wonder. Steve sat down beside her, holding her hand gently. "Jessica, I have something important to ask you," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "How would you feel about coming to live with me and Aaron, as part of our family?" Jessica's eyes filled with tears, and her lip trembled. "You mean, you want to adopt me?" she whispered, almost not believing it. Steve nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "More than anything, Jessica, you've brought so much joy into our lives, and I can't imagine my family without you in it." With a cry of pure happiness, Jessica threw her arms around him. "Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes." As Steve held her, he felt a sense of completeness he hadn't known since Sarah's passing. The road ahead would be difficult, but with Aaron and Jessica by his side, Steve felt ready to face whatever came their way.